Okay, so we're ready for our third. I don't know if it's a third class, but it's the third section of the Song of Songs. And the third section covers the third section covers a nice chunk from chapter 3, verse 6 to chapter 6. So there's a few chapters that are in the third section, and we're going to discuss the third section, discuss what's happening in the story, and after we do that, we'll discuss what the interpretation is, because as we know, the Song of Songs is a mashal, it's a parable, and after the parable, we want to figure out what the parable is saying. And after we talk about the parable, we want to say what the interpretation of the parable is. So we'll take a minute or two just to review the first two sections. The first section was primarily from the perspective of the woman, and she describes herself as obviously in love with this guy. We don't know exactly who it is, but sooner or later we find out. Today we find out it's actually the king, and the sort of the tension in that first story, the tension in the first section is that while she is very anxious to move forward with the relationship, her love is not mature, and in the sense that she's not really committed, and that's why we discussed that refers to the sin of the golden calf that followed the Exodus of Egypt. And because of that, the husband or the man is not necessarily ready to give the girl or the woman, the young woman, he's not really willing to tell her where he is. So she's searching for him. She keeps saying, tell me where you are. She also starts talking to him about a home and furniture, and he is not yet there. So he's not even telling her where he is. He says, go look for me amongst the shepherds. So that's the first perspective. That's the first song. The second song, things flip. In the second song, we read how he comes to her and he says, it's wonderful. Look at nature. Nature is flourishing. All the flowers are blooming. The birds are singing. The winter is over. The rain season has passed. Everything is wonderful. So let's go out together to the field. And from the second song's perspective, the man is ready. The young man is ready, but she is not ready. She says, well, I have all kinds of business to take care of. I'm guarding my orchard. There are foxen coming to the orchard. Why don't you come back later? And that's, in fact, what happens. She sends him away in the second song. And toward the end of the second song, what happens is she now is waiting for her. She now is waiting for him to come back. So she's lying in bed, waiting for him. He doesn't appear. So she's now looking for him in the streets, looking for her beloved man, and she doesn't find him. And that was the conclusion of the second song. And we said that according to most opinions, both songs are covering the same period of time. They're just talking from the various perspectives of God or the Jewish people, or the young man and the young woman. And what they both have is that both not necessarily the relationship is not mature to the point where they're both ready to commit at the same time. And that's where we lead up to the third section and the third song. And the third song it covers about 3 chapters of the 8 of the Song of Songs. And the third song is sort of the most interesting because there are really swings in the third section. The third section is really made up of 3 parts. The first part is you describe a wedding. There's a wedding going on. So we assume this is the wedding of the young man and his beloved young woman. Okay? So that's beautiful. What could be better than a wedding? They live happily ever after. The movie is over. But of course, in reality, that's not the way it works. And in reality, the wedding is not necessarily the end of the quest for love, but maybe the wedding is actually the beginning, because the wedding introduces its own challenges. And while the song doesn't exactly say explicitly what the challenges are, but the second scene in the third song is there's already a problem. The problem is that her beloved is knocking on the door and she doesn't want to open the door. So we'll discuss that. So there was already some separation after the wedding. And that's the second part of the third song. And the third part of the third song is where she once again is roaming the city looking for her beloved, and not only she doesn't find him, but she doesn't find him. So that's the third point. So just to summarize what we're going to learn today, but we may get into the fourth song today, but for the third song today represents the three scenes in the third song. There's the wedding. There is after the wedding, for whatever reason, they're not together, and he is knocking on the door, trying to get into her home, and she's not opening the door. So that's scene 2 of song 3. And then the third scene in song 3 is now, once again, she is searching for him, right? The pattern repeats. When he's ready, she's not ready, etc., as we discussed. Okay, so I think in the beginning we'll read a few verses. We'll read some of the verses, try to go by quickly, because it's about 3 chapters. We'll try to go by quickly, and just to get the scene straight, just to get the metaphor straight, just to get the story straight, before we start focusing on the interpretation. So if you want to look at the third scene, it's chapter 3, verse 6. You can, if you have a handout, good. Otherwise, you can Google it. Song of Songs, chapter 3. Otherwise, you could just listen, and that's good as well. So, who is coming up from the desert like columns of smoke, perfumed with myrrh and frankincense, of all the powder of the peddler? What does this mean? It means there's a wedding. There's a wedding planned, but nobody knows who the bride is. So the bride is sort of coming from the desert, and she's all perfumed, and she's got all the perfumes, and the perfumes of various sorts of oil, etc., and smoke, because in those days they would smoke. They would create the perfume. They would burn the incense, and that would create the perfume. But again, if you remember that we discussed, is that the woman is coming now. She's not from the capital city. She's coming from the desert, the Judean desert, Ein Gedi. That's where she's from. So now she emerges from the desert, coming to Jerusalem, coming to the wedding. Not everybody knows who she is. So that's what the verse says. Who? Yes.
Are we talking about chapter 3 of Shir Shirim?
Absolutely. Chapter 3, verse 6.
Chapter 3. I don't see any wedding.
You see verse 6.
Verse 6. Okay. Who is coming from the desert like columns of smoke? Okay, continue. I'm sorry.
Okay, now the reason why you don't see the wedding is because the wedding is not going to appear until verse 11. Right? It's poetry, so not everything is in order. But if you scroll down to the bottom of the page, if you go down to the bottom of the chapter, verse 11, go out, O daughters of Zion, and gaze upon King Solomon, upon the crown which his mother crowned him on the day of his nuptials and on the day of the joy of his heart. Okay? So we're talking about this whole celebration is the wedding.
Okay.
So now, if there's a wedding, but before the wedding, they say, who is coming up from the desert? Well, I have no idea who's talking about who. So one way to read it is we're talking about the bride. We're talking about the woman. Why is she coming from the desert? Well, we mentioned before that she probably lives in the desert. She probably lives in Ein Gedi. And nobody really knows who she is. And she's all perfumed and all prepared for the wedding, but it doesn't mean everybody knows who she is. So that's verse 6. And now we describe, so she's coming from the desert, and now she's entering the palace. What happens when you enter the palace? Could you see the king? No, you can't see the king. Verse 7, behold, the litter of Solomon, or the bed. 60 mighty men are around it, of the mighty men of Israel. They all hold swords, skilled in warfare, each one with his sword on his thigh, because of fear at night. In other words, when you come into the palace, you don't automatically see the king. What do you see? You see all the guards. You see all the protectors. There are 60 people just standing around Solomon's bed. And remember, this is part of the tension of the story, which you mentioned till now, where the woman's idea of love and the man's idea of love is different because she's a simple woman from Ein Gedi. All she wants is to be alone with her beloved. And that I'm not sure the king could do that. So that's part of the underlying tension that goes throughout the book. That her idea of love and his idea of love is not the same thing. So here she shows up, and she's describing. She's emerging from the desert. She enters the palace, and what do you talk about? The guards. So that's verse 7 and 8. And then you talk about verse 9. So verse 9 is the canopy, the chuppah. King Solomon made himself a palanquin, I guess that's the way you pronounce it, of the trees of Lebanon. So back then it was a chuppah. A chuppah wasn't like today, just a covering, but a chuppah is sort of the entire room or a bed where the bride and groom seclude themselves in. Now, what happens in that place? So we know it's made of trees of Lebanon. Its pillars are made of silver. Its couch of gold. Its curtain of purple. Its interior inlaid with love from the daughters of Jerusalem. That's very strange. Okay, imagine we're talking about the wedding. We're talking about the chuppah. We're talking about where the bride and groom are supposed to be secluded. And what do we talk about? What does the verse say? That the inner, its inward, its interior is inlaid with love from the daughters of Jerusalem, meaning there are other, either, I don't know if it means literally or figuratively, but there's also other love from other women that are in that chuppah, in that canopy, in that place that's supposed to be just for the bride and groom. So that's part of the problem. That's part of the tension. That's the way it works in the king's palace, but that's not what she is used to. We continue, and then finally we read verse 11, which, as Jill points out, that's the first place where it actually explicitly states that there's a wedding, but this is in some ways the highlight of the sort of the climax of the book. In some sense, it seems like everything this is where it's all leading to. She wants to marry. In chapter 1, she's asking him, where are we going to live? She starts talking to him about the home and the furniture. And finally, we talk about that there's a wedding. Go out, O daughters of Zion, and gaze upon King Solomon, upon the crown upon which his mother crowned him, on the day of his nuptials, and on the day of the joy of his heart. So we know we have the marriage. Wonderful. Everything is fine. Like I said, if it would be a Hollywood story, they would be over. But because it's a real story, the tension is just beginning. It's not resolved. Okay, so the commentaries explain, there's different ways of reading what exactly we're referring to, but the commentaries are explained that with the wedding. What's the wedding? What's the wedding between the Jewish people and God? So there are actually different interpretations. The Mishnah says it refers to the giving of the Torah, but we're not going to follow that interpretation. The interpretation that we're going to follow is that the wedding is the actual building of the temple in Jerusalem through King Solomon. And why are we taking that approach? Because the difference between God's presence amongst the Jewish people up to the point where King Solomon builds the temple. In other words, from when the Jewish people leave Egypt until the temple is built, it's over 400 years. And there was a temporary tabernacle, a temporary sanctuary that would travel with the Jewish people. And once they entered Israel, it was more permanent, but still it was not completely permanent. It was in multiple places. And even the place Shiloh, where it was for a very long time, for 369 years, nevertheless, that was not considered the permanent place of the temple. And therefore, once Shiloh was destroyed, it's no longer a holy site. But however, once the temple is built in Jerusalem, there the verse says that place is the place that God will choose, and that place is holy up till this day. In other words, where do you get permanence? Where is the permanent relationship? This sort of the establishing of the relationship between God and the Jewish people in a permanent way, that occurs in the that occurs in the temple. And therefore, who built the temple? Solomon. And therefore, in the metaphor, we say it's Solomon's wedding. Why is it Solomon's wedding? Well, Solomon makes the wedding happen. Of course, we also have the interpretation that I mentioned in the past, that the Medrash says every time it says Solomon in the Holy of Holies, almost every time it refers to the king, Hashem. It refers to God, because Solomon means peace, and Melech Shalom Shalom, the king whose peace belongs to him, is God. So the king Solomon having a wedding could be a reference to Hashem. It's Hashem's wedding with the Jewish people. But I think Solomon inserts his name here because Solomon himself was instrumental in the building of the wedding, in the construction of the temple, and that is something that we understand. Solomon is the one who creates that sense of permanence. Now, once you read that, you start reading verse 9. For example, King Solomon made himself a palanquin of the trees of Lebanon. Well, Lebanon was critical for, first of all, Lebanon in the Torah is a metaphor for the temple. When Moshe wants to enter the land of Israel in the book of Deuteronomy, which we're going to, in the second portion of the book of Deuteronomy, which we're going to read in 2 weeks, Moshe says, "V'chanan al Hashem, I implored God, and I really wanted to enter the beautiful mountain and the Lebanon." Moshe wanted to enter Lebanon. What's in Lebanon? Well, Rashi says, quotes the Medrash, that the beautiful mountain is Jerusalem and Lebanon is the temple. Moshe wanted to enter the land to be able to establish the temple. It wasn't meant to be, but you see the word Levanon, the word Lebanon refers to the temple. Why? So in Hebrew, Levanon is the same word as Lavan, white. And the rabbis say the temple is called Lebanon because the temple whitens the sins of Israel. In the Bible, red is a symbol for passion and for sin, and white is a symbol for purity and atonement. So when it says King Solomon made his chuppah, made his canopy of a wedding canopy of trees of Lebanon, again, this is a clear reference to the temple and clear reference to the temple, and because again, this is the permanence, this is the marriage between God and the Jewish people. Now,
I do have a question.
Yes.
The other interpretation, the marriage took place at Sinai, and this is a different interpretation.
The other interpretation is that if you say, in other words, there's 2 interpretations. You could read the book in a sense that the book represents the love between God and the Jewish people, and the challenges to this love. But the book does not have to follow it doesn't have to follow the order of history. If that's the case, then this could be Sinai, because Sinai was certainly part of the wedding, right? I don't want to get into it, but in the Jewish wedding, there's really 2 sections. There's Kiddushin and Nisuin. There's betrothal and the marriage. And Sinai was certainly the betrothal. It's the beginning of the wedding process. So the Mishnah, for example, says that that the wedding is referring to Sinai. But the other commentaries feel that if you want to read the book and make it more, if you want to read the book, you want to read it in a sense that it should follow the order of history. In that sense, well, we already mentioned Sinai in chapter 1. Ad she'hamelech b'mesiba, the king was at his party, and the smell came up. Rashi already said over there that refers to the king's at his party, at his engagement party at Sinai, and while the king is at his engagement party, the bride is creating the golden calf. So if you want to read it that it's following the order of history, then the other interpretation of the other commentaries that this refers to Sinai, this refers to the building of the temple, that's more palpable because it follows the order of history. Others say it's poetry, it doesn't have to follow the order of history. So for the sake of clarity, I think it's nice to read it sort of in the historical context, and therefore Sinai is more of the engagement party, because in other words, that's where the relationship is initiated, but it's not permanent, right? Imagine, right? You can think about permanence. You get married, certainly in the ancient world. What is marriage? Marriage means you move in together. And at that point, the Jewish people didn't move in together with God. In other words, there wasn't a symbol of the permanence. Even the tabernacle that the Jewish people built was designed to be portable, meaning it was designed to be temporary. It was designed to not contain the concept of permanence, because we weren't there yet. Spiritually speaking, we were not developed to that point where the relationship is permanent. And when you actually build the temple, it's not just a piece of real estate. It's not just a structure. It's not just that Solomon builds got a better contractor and they built a better building that could last longer. That's not what it is. What it is that the building represents that the relationship now is permanent. Now, permanent doesn't mean there's no ups and downs. As you will see, there's plenty of ups and downs. Even right, the next scene after the wedding, there's already a tremendous challenge. And it almost seems that it doesn't fit, but in reality, it does fit, because all we're saying is that the relationship is permanent. We're not saying that the relationship is tension-free or problem-free. If that makes any sense.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Rabbi,
Yes.
so what does it mean when the temple is destroyed? What happens to that permanence?
Well, we have to get to, well, the temple is destroyed, even though the temple is destroyed, and that is correct, and that's actually, we're studying, we're mourning that destruction period right now. But the Torah says that the place of the temple is holy. So in other words, the permanence is always there. The question is, could we see it? If it's above the ground, it's visible to all. Our love is enduring, our love is permanent, and it's visible. But what happens if we're sinning? So if you want to forget about God, if we're talking about that right now, we're not talking to each other for whatever reason, there's tension between the man and his beloved, or the beloved and her husband and her man, depending on from which perspective. So there's tension, so you don't see the relationship. So you don't see it. That means above the surface, it doesn't exist. But deep down in their heart, the relationship is permanent. So the actual constructed temple is the expression of the love. But the fact that the temple mountain is holy and permanently holy, that means that the relationship is cemented. The relationship is permanent. The relationship cannot be changed. What could be changed is the expression of the relationship. And that's why in the halacha, when you finish building the tabernacle and you move the tabernacle from point A to point B, and if you read this week's parsha, we'll discuss it tomorrow, that there are 42 stops where the tabernacle, where the temple, actually a little less because they didn't build a temple right away. But when we list all the stops in the desert, the 42 steps where the Jewish people traveled from Egypt up to the plains of the Jordan River, and each place when they packed up the temple and moved it to the next place, that original place was not holy. It wasn't a permanent place. In fact, Sinai itself was not holy. As soon as God, this is to Jill's point, it was Sinai the wedding. As soon as the Jewish people come to Sinai, God gives a few regulations. He says, nobody climbed nobody climbs Sinai. You can't touch Sinai. If you touch Sinai, you will die. But then it says, right away, he says, as soon as the ceremony is over, anybody can climb the mountain. In other words, immediately, God already says, don't get too attached to this place because this place is a nice ceremony, but it's not permanent, and therefore the actual soil of Sinai does not become holy, which is probably why the Jewish people don't even know exactly which mountain Sinai is. The Arabs have a tradition, they call it Nebe Musa, the mountain of Moses, but I don't know that I don't think there were Arabs all the way going back. In other words, there was a tradition going back to Moshe, so I wouldn't trust that one either. But in any case, we don't have a tradition where Mount Sinai is. You would ask, Mount Sinai, what an important event. No, it wasn't that. It was an important event, but the place was not important because the permanent, there's no permanence. When you get to the temple, even if a temple is destroyed, there's a verse that's derived from the Torah. In the rebuke, it says, "V'hashimoti et mikdashechem," I'm going to make your sanctuary desolate. And the rabbis derive, even when it's desolate, it's a sanctuary, right? The sanctuary means mikdash, means holy. Even when it's hashimoti, even when it's shamem, even when it's desolate, nevertheless, it's holy. And that's where you get the permanence. And why is that place permanence? Not because there's something about the real estate, even though it probably it's an interesting place. It's layered with history going all the way back to Noach and Adam, etc. But what it really is, it's an expression of the permanence of the bond between God and the Jewish people. If that makes sense. Okay, now we have an entire chapter, chapter 4, which is all part of the sort of the post-wedding ceremony or the wedding ceremony. And really what is happening here is this is a speech. Who's the speech? At the wedding, the man is singing his love to his wife, and he's got all kinds of descriptions and detailed descriptions of her beauty. And of course, if we had time, we could literally read every single verse and read the Rashi and see exactly what each verse represents. But I don't know if we'll do that. I just want to read a few verses of chapter 4 just to get a feel of what's happening at the wedding. You know, at the wedding, sometimes, I don't know if they do, but sometimes they ask I guess they do. I guess the groom is going to speak. So maybe this is the groom's wedding speech. A pretty nice one. Maybe yeah, it's nice. It's very descriptive, and it talks about her beauty. And this is the description of the man talking to his beloved. If you're on the Chabad.org, you could switch over to the next chapter, chapter 4, or you could just listen. I'm not going to read all of it. It's too many verses, not that many. It's 16 verses, but I really want to get to the next scene in Song 3, which is all of a sudden, out of nowhere, we get this separation between, they're not even together in the same home. Forget about she's not opening up the door for him. There's a lot of problems coming up. So we want to get to that as well. So I'm just going to read a few verses, Song of Songs, chapter 4. Hinach yafara ayati. Behold, verse 1, you are fear, my beloved. Fear means beautiful. Behold, you are fear. Your eyes are like doves from within your kerchief. Your hair is like a flock of goats that stream down from Mount Gilead. Right? Gilead is in the Galilee. And here you have the metaphor is the goats streaming down the mountain is the hair streaming down streaming down her shoulders. Your teeth are like a flock of uniformly shaped ewes that come up from the washing, all of whom are perfect, and there is no bereavement among them. Your lips are like scarlet thread, and your speech is comely. Your temple is like a split pomegranate from within your kerchief. Your neck is like the Tower of David, built as a model, 1,000 shields hanging on it. All the quivers of the mighty men, etc., etc., etc. Your two breasts are like two fawns, the twins of Gazalit who gaze among the roses. He keeps going, and he starts talking about how he makes her feel, how she makes him feel. He keeps going. And that's it. Beautiful. The wedding is over. The speeches are over. And the next scene opens up, which is scene 2 of which is the second part of the third song. And it really starts in chapter 5, verse 2. Here is the scene. I have no idea when this happens or why this happens, but it certainly indicates that there's a problem. What's the problem? The scene is, I said, I'm sleeping, my heart's awake. The beloved is knocking on the door. He says, it's raining outside, open up the door. She doesn't want to open up the door. Why doesn't she open the door? Because she already took off her garment, so she's not dressed. So to get out of bed, she'll have to get dressed again. And also, she already washed her feet. And remember, they were living in a different period. So the earth is, the floor is earth. So if you want to get out of bed to open the door, your feet are going to get dirty. And then you're going to have to wash your feet again. So she's not interested. She's too lazy. So she's lying in bed and he's knocking on the door. So we're going to read a few verses of chapter 5, the second scene of the third song, and then we'll explain what the period is what the verse is referring to. So here we go. I sleep, but my heart is awake. Hark, my beloved is knocking. Open for me, my sister, my beloved, my dove, my perfect one. Okay, a lot of descriptions. Kol daidi. So the beloved says, the man says, open for me. He's talking to her. He calls her my sister, my beloved, my dove, my perfect one. So he's giving her all the praises. He wants her to open. For my head is full of dew, my locks with the drops of the night. In other words, he's outside, he's getting wet, it's raining, and he's knocking, and he wants her to open the door. Now she speaks. I have taken off my tunic. How can I put it on? I have bathed my feet. How can I soil them? I want me to get out of bed and get dressed and then get my feet dirty and open the door. And then I'm going to have to get undressed and bathe my feet again. It's too complicated. So she's not moving. So that's the scene. The scene's they're married. He's knocking. It's raining outside. He's got no umbrella. My hair is getting wet. And she doesn't want to go anywhere. She's not ready. My beloved stretched forth his hand from the hole, and my insides stirred because of him. So what does this mean? Back in the day, the way they had their lock, the way they would lock the door, they had a lock which was basically a beam, and then they had a hole within the door where you could stick your hand in and put in the key. So you're standing outside, you stick your hand in, and then you can unlock the lock. So she sees his hand literally in the home trying to open up the door. Now that scene, that he's so anxious to get in, that scene makes her heart stir toward him. And my insides stirred because of him. All over the prophets, my insides is my heart. That appears all over the place. So the heart, she sees how insistent he is to get in, and she all of a sudden says, you know what? I'm going to go and I'm going to respond. I'm going to go out toward him. So verse 5, I arose to open for my beloved, and my hands dripped with mirth, and my fingers with flowing mirth upon the handles of the lock. So now she's describing she's trying to open it, but it's hard to open the lock if your hands are oily. Why are they oily? They're oily with spices. They're oily with perfume. Like we mentioned, that the perfume then was with oil. Now the problem is, finally she gets the lock open, and what happens? Of course, he's not there anymore. He sees that she's knocking, she's not opening, he leaves. Finally, by the time she gets to the door, he is gone. So verse 5, I arose to open for my beloved. We read verse 5. Verse 6, I opened for my beloved, but my beloved had hidden and was gone. My soul went out when he spoke, which means she had a great yearning for him. I sought him, but I found him not. I called him, but he did not answer me. Okay, so now she's calling to him, she's gone, she can't find him. And now we get a bigger problem. The bigger problem is that she's walking, and this is really the third scene. The third scene, even though it's a very short verse, a verse or two, this is the third scene where it's taking place. So in other words, scene 1 is taking place at the wedding. Scene 2 takes place in her home. For whatever reason, he's not there. She's not trying to get in. She doesn't want to let him in. By the time she opens the door, he's gone. And then the third part of the third song takes place in the streets of Jerusalem, because she goes after him, looking for him. So she says, it's only the watchmen, verse 7, the watchmen who patrol the city found me. They smote me and wounded me. Right? Till then, up to that point, the first time where she was looking for her husband, the watchmen just asked them, what are you looking for? And the watchmen are trying to help her find her beloved. Here, they suspect that there's something wrong, because why is this woman running around in the middle of the night? So they actually beat her and they harm her. And the watchmen of the walls took my jewelry off me. Right? So they took off the jewelry. It could be a jewelry, or it could be a redid. It could be a scarf or a kerchief. But in any case, it's a total different scene. She's running around looking for her beloved. And instead, the people around, the guards of the city, not only they don't help her, but they are harming her and taking away her jewelry. And here we have again, just like last time it said, she's interesting verse, which maybe we'll discuss in the future. I adjure you, O daughters of Jerusalem, if you find my beloved, what will you tell him? That I am lovesick. We had that verse at the end of Song 1, at the end of Song 2. And was it Song 1 or Song 2? I don't remember. I'll check in a second. But we had this verse earlier in the song. And over there, she's talking to the daughters of Jerusalem. And she says, I make you swear. It's actually Song 1. I make you swear, do not awaken the love when it's premature. So in other words, she's saying, don't. She's telling her friends or the other people or the spectators, the daughters of Jerusalem, don't awaken the love because we're not ready yet. Now her message to the daughters of Jerusalem, now her message to the surrounding people, to the spectators, is if you happen to find my beloved, tell him that I am lovesick. Tell him that I really love him. Why does she have to say that? She has to say that because she just did not open to her beloved, right? So if you're the man And the man left. He's knocking on the door. He's in desperation. It's raining. It's pouring rain. He's knocking on the door. She doesn't open the door. So what is the man supposed to think? Well, the man thinks she doesn't love me anymore. And therefore he's gone. So now that's what she tells the daughters of Jerusalem. She tells them, if you happen to see my beloved, what should you tell him? Tell him, Shechai Lasava, tell him I am lovesick. That's the conclusion of That's the conclusion. Yeah, that's the conclusion, I suppose, of the third seed.
Rabbi, is all this like the perspective of the people of Israel? Because God certainly doesn't have ups and downs. This is the experience of the Jewish people with God.
This is the relationship. This is the relationship. In other words, God is not going to...
It's not so much the relationship, it's the Jewish people's experience of the relationship.
Agreed. So the metaphor is, it's not really talking about his perspective, the man's perspective, or God's perspective. Does God love her at this point? We don't know. We assume yes. Later on, we see that yes. But from the perspective of the woman, all we know is that he's not present. He knocked on the door. We'll explain what that means. He knocked on the door, and now he's gone. So if he's gone, the Jewish people could be mistaken, could be justified in thinking that that the relationship is over, that God is no longer interested in the relationship. Part of the point of the song is to say that it's not the case. We always discuss this within the Torah. Every time the Torah discusses the exile, the Torah goes out of its way to explain that the exile does not mean that the relationship is terminated. It just means that God hides his face. So here the love is hidden. Yes, there are certain periods of time where the woman is looking for God, the Jewish people are looking for God, and God is not present, right? We don't need, this is the story of Jewish history, certainly of the exile. God is not present. So what does that mean? It means that he's not here. Now, what do you make with that information? So what the woman is telling the people and the people of Jerusalem, so it's the spectators of the other nations, any way you explain it, she's saying, I have this message for you. Tell my beloved, tell my husband, tell the man, tell my husband, Shechai Lasava, I am lovesick. Just because I didn't open when he knocked, it doesn't mean that I don't have feelings for him. But the story of Jewish exile is that we can't find God. We don't see his presence. Now we believe that God is still in love with us. Well, that's part of what this song is portraying. After the marriage, there's still tension, and there's still difficulty, and there's still separation, and there's still this concept where we have to work to maintain the love, because it's not going to happen by itself. But I agree, this is the perspective of the Jewish people, because from God's perspective, we believe the love is always there. But the question is he always showing the love? Of course not, right? So even from God's perspective, there is a change. Now, God is not always showing the love. God is not always showing the Jewish people his providence. Sometimes we don't see it. Sometimes we say, where are you? King David says, where are you? Lama Zavtani, why have you forsaken me? Of course, there may be a reason. It may be out of love. It may be for all kinds of reasons. But in reality, there is a difference between in how God reveals himself to the people throughout Jewish history. Okay, of course I made a little mistake here. The third scene is not over. The conversation continues. So we have here, it's a little bit more. It's not really concluded yet. We're still in the third scene. The third scene, once she's talking to daughters of Jerusalem, saying, tell my beloved that I am lovesick. So they want to know what's so special about your beloved. Verse 9. What is your beloved more than another beloved, O fairest of women? In other words, they're saying, why are you so into the guy? He's not here. Move on. Find somebody else. In Hebrew, it's very poetic. Ma dodech midod. What is your beloved more than other beloveds? What's so great about it? Shekacha ishbatanu, that you have so adjured us, that to tell him that you're lovesick. What's so great about it? So now for the first time, she is describing him, because now she has to speak to the daughters of Jerusalem and explain her deep bond for him even after he's not appearing. And here you have the whole speech. His head is as the finest gold. His locks are curled. They are as black as raven. His eyes are like doves beside rivulets of water, bathing in milk, filthily set. Keeps going. His jaws, etc., all the way to the end of the chapter. And she is telling the daughters of Jerusalem about why the specialty, why her beloved is more than other beloveds. So again, to summarize, we have three scenes. Scene number one is the wedding. We discussed that. We said that's the time, that's the period of the building of the temple where the relationship between God and the Jewish people becomes permanent. Scene two is when, for whatever reason, he's not home. He's knocking on the door. She doesn't want to open. She has all the good excuses, but she doesn't want to open. Finally, he's insisting. He's putting his hand in the hole, trying to open up the lock, insisting that she wants to get in, and that inspires her. And by the time she responds and she gets out of bed and she opens up, he's already gone. And then she goes out. She gets caught by the guardians of the city, and they harm her. They beat her. They take away her jewelry. And then she has the conversation with the daughters of Jerusalem. First, she says, if you ever happen to see my beloved, tell him that I am lovesick. That's message number one. And then they get into the conversation where they ask her, what's so great about your husband? And she responds with many, many verses of praise. Finally, she's praising him as well. Okay, so that's the metaphor. Now, what is the interpretation? So we already said the interpretation of the first scene, which is the wedding. Now we have to talk about the interpretation of the second scene and the third scene. So it's already 10:45, maybe another 3, 4, 5 minutes. We'll go a little bit over, and we'll bring the third song to a close. Okay, like everything else in the song, we have at least two ways to interpret it, so you're going to be able to go home and pick the one you want. One interpretation is that we're talking about scene two, when the husband is knocking on the door, saying, I'm wet, I'm in desperation, my beautiful hair locks, I spent so much money on the hairstyle, and now it's getting ruined in the rain and in the dew, it's getting all frizzled. You got to let me in. And she's not going anywhere. She's not opening up the door. What period is that referring to? So there's at least two interpretations. One interpretation, that's Rashi, according to Medrash, is it's referring to the period after the temple was built. So in other words, the entire period of the first temple. What is the story of the period of the first temple? The story is that the Jewish people, even after, once the temple was built, the Jewish people follow idol worship. Certainly the northern kingdom of Israel, the 10 tribes, and occasionally also the southern kingdom, the 2 tribes of Judah and Benjamin, where the temple stood. So we have a story after the wedding. Once the temple is built, you would say, wow, it's beautiful. Now they're finally married and everything, they live happily ever after. But of course, that's just the beginning of the story. The temple is built and the people are straying after idol worship. So that is God knocking on the door and saying, open up for me. And he praises her, 4 expressions of praise. And he's trying to awaken the Jews to repent, and the Jewish people are not repenting. Why are they not repenting? We have our old habits. In the prophets, the Jewish people articulate this. They said, we already learned from the surrounding nations. We already developed habits of idol worship. You want us to change our ways. You want us to abandon our pagan ways that we learned from the surrounding nations and start serving God again? That's too difficult. We already washed our feet. We're already comfortable in bed. We don't want to get out of bed and actually have to improve. That takes too much effort. Okay. What's the next part of this scene? The next part, God sends in his hand. In other words, the man sends in his hand to try to open the door. God insists. He tries to get his way in. So if you follow this interpretation, God sending in his hand represents God sending the prophets. All the prophets in the period of the first temple is God trying to put his hand in and get the Jews to open the door almost forcefully to allow the relationship between God and the Jewish people to resume. Now, what's happening here is the prophets, at least some of them, are partially successful. And some of them actually get the Jewish people to return and love God. But nevertheless, when they open the door. So in some sense, God's putting in his hand, creating that awakening, gets the people to respond. However, it's already too late. It was already destined that the first temple should be destroyed. And because it was destined that the first temple should be destroyed, that's why, even though she opened the door, but it's already too late. So the prophets finally, the Jewish people to some degree did incorporate some of the teachings of the prophets, but it was too late, and the man is gone. And then what does it mean that the guards of the city found her and beat her? According to this interpretation, this refers to Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, who destroys the first temple. Right? So we have everything here. It all follows the pattern of history. And then we continue to say the daughters of Jerusalem, these are the other nations. And the other nations ask the Jewish people, why are you still committed to God in exile? Your beloved is no longer here. He's not interested in you. So what's so special of him? In other words, when they see the commitment of the Jewish people to God in exile, that's an inspiration. They say, what is so special about this beloved that you're so committed to him? And that's why she continues and tries to describe him. Maybe next week we'll talk about what those descriptions mean. But in any case, according to this interpretation, the second scene and the third scene refer to the God knocking on the door refers to the second period of the first temple when the Jewish people are serving the idols, and then the guards that find her and beat her, that refers to after that Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, destroying the temple. That's one interpretation. Another interpretation, which is actually also interesting, is that we are referring to the time we're skipping a little bit. We're not referring to we're not referring to the era of the first temple. We're referring to the exile after the first temple. So after the first temple was destroyed, the Jewish people were exiled to Babylonia for 70 years. After the 70-year period, God wants the Jewish people to be inspired and repent and return to Jerusalem, because God said after 70 years we'll return to Jerusalem. In reality, it didn't really happen. Only some Jews decided to go back. Most of the Jews stayed in Babylonia. So the rabbis explained. So one interpretation is that when it says that my beloved is knocking on the door, it's God says time to move back to Israel, because the 70 years of period of the Babylonian exile have concluded. Now the Jewish people don't want to go back to Israel. Why don't they want to go back to Israel? We're already comfortable in bed. Well, what's the bed? It's the exile. We're very comfortable here, so we don't want to go. And it was very difficult to live in Israel at the time. And so they don't want to go. So then what happens? God says he sends forth his hand. What does that mean? That was the proclamation of Koresh, the king of Persia, who gave permission to build the temple. Oh, that's sort of an inspiration when the king of a superpower says you have permission to go build the temple. That did inspire some Jews to go. However, it took too long. What does it mean it took too long? Not enough people went to open the door quick enough. And therefore, if you know the history, Koresh receded his permission to build the second temple, and it was delayed for a number of years until later, Darius, a later king, gave them permission. So according to the first interpretation, we're referring to the period up to the destruction of the first temple. According to the second interpretation, we're referring to when God is trying to awaken the Jews to leave Babylonia, to go back to Israel. And this is really telling you why the second temple was not as glorious as the first. In other words, why wasn't the relationship fully restored? We know that in the second temple, there was no prophecy. We know that in the second temple, the Jewish people, they didn't really have true autonomy because they were pretty much for most of the time ruled by either Greece or Rome. We know that there were no more prophets during the period of the second temple. We know the ark was gone, as I said. So in general, the second temple did not have the spiritual power or the spiritual experience of the first temple. Why did that happen? That happened, according to this interpretation, it happened because the Jews did not respond quick enough to go and build the second temple. And therefore, when they finally opened the door, the guy was already gone. And then the armies, the people hitting her refers to the destruction of the second temple. And then the fourth song represents the period of the exile that we are currently in, and that's the fourth period, and we'll discuss that next week, and maybe we'll conclude next week, or maybe we'll do another week. We'll see how this plays out. In any case, I hope you enjoyed. I hope this was interesting, and if you have any questions, please share. Otherwise, have a wonderful day, and we will see you sometime in the future in good health, on Zoom, off Zoom, but the main thing is in good health.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Rabbi,
Al.
one question.
Yes.
How do we know that we're right now not repeating the same history of the Jews in Babylon that didn't want to go back after they were able to? So like now, we have the ability to go back to Israel, but we're comfortable here in exile and we're not working to restore the state, to restore.
Right.
And I understand, it's not a peaceful time and we have to wait for the right time. But as far as, I understand that, like the Rebbe said, we have our job here to do here in exile and we're comfortable that we have our mission here. But how do we know that Hashem's not expecting us right now to be going back and trying our best to create the state, like a true biblical state?
Okay, so if you hang up from this call and you go onto YouTube and you put in Song of Songs and you find a class, a lecture by religious Zionist rabbis, that's what they'll tell you. They'll tell you that that we are repeating history. The Jewish people who are in the exile, in the diaspora, are repeating history, not responding. And all the problems in Israel happen because there are still many Jews outside of Israel. And that's what they will tell you. Obviously, that's not what I'm going to tell you because I'm also out of Israel. Because the differences are important. The difference is that there they had a specific sort of declaration that they have to be in Israel that they exiled for 70 years, and now God wants them to come back. That was clear. And today, it's not in that same situation. We don't have that message from God that we have to go back to Israel. We are, at least from our perspective, we are still in exile. The redemption has not yet come. And the redemption has not yet come, and therefore our work in exile has not been concluded. Now, it is true that the pattern is being repeated to the extent that we have to make sure that when there is a spiritual inspiration that we, what's the word I'm looking for? That we capture it and we internalize it. So, for example, after the 6-day war, where there was sort of an open miracle or many miracles, the Rebbe spoke that this is the Jewish people have been inspired, right? And this is God sending forth his hand. And you have to move to Israel, either literally or figuratively, right? So moving to Israel would mean, could you take that inspiration and make that part of your life? Could you realize that God is reaching out to you and could you reciprocate? And that would be increasing Torah and mitzvot. And that is making Israel. We know the Hasidic saying that Tzemach Tzedek told his follower, he wanted to go to Israel. He said, make Israel here. So there's no question that the pattern, we have to be careful not to repeat the pattern in the sense that when God sends forth his hand, and that's the message. The message is when there's a moment of inspiration, don't think that it's going to be here forever. You have to seize the moment. That is clear. When there's a miracle, you have to seize the moment God is talking to you. You have to make change in your life, and you have to move to Israel. Whether or not it means moving to Israel literally or figuratively, that's an individual question because we're still in exile. In the time of Koresh, there we had prophets, and Ezra, and Nehemiah, and we had Jeremiah, who said it's 70 years, and now it's time to move, right? So that's clear. We know when the exile ends. Here, the exile has not ended. So certainly from the Hasidic perspective, we have work in exile. And therefore, it's an individualistic question of whether an individual should move to Israel. Maybe the answer for some people is yes. Maybe the answer for some people is they have to make Israel here. In other words, move to Israel in the metaphoric sense. But it's clear that, again, the 2 points are that some people will tell you you're right, you're reading the story right, and we're wrong for not being in Israel. Our perspective is, my perspective, Chabad's perspective, Hasidic perspective is that we have to listen, heed the call, and we have to make Israel here. We have to move to Israel spiritually. When the time comes, we'll also move to Israel physically. But it's different.
So from a Hasidic perspective, Hashem's going to send us a more obvious message when he's really, really knocking and saying it's time to come.
When the Mashiach is here, the Mashiach's here. Maimonides lays out what it means when Mashiach is here. And in fact, if you read Maimonides, it talks about first there'll be a king in Israel. First Mashiach comes, then he builds the temple, and afterward he'll gather in the exiles. In other words, the ingathering of the exile, according to Maimonides, is actually after the building of the temple. Now, some people say Maimonides is not saying that this is the way it must be, but the Rebbe felt always that Maimonides, the order is very important, and because no other commentaries in his time disputed him, they all agreed with him. So, in other words, it's clear that this halachic criteria of when Mashiach comes, that halachic criteria has not been met, and therefore some people should move to Israel. But to say that everybody has to move to Israel is not correct. Everybody, however, has to move to Israel in the spiritual sense. And what does Israel mean? Medrash says many times, Israel is the land that Eretz Sheratzta La'asot Ratzon Konah, the land that wants to do God's will. So moving to Israel doesn't just mean you're going to the better climate and going to surf the waters of the Mediterranean and sit in the cafes in Tel Aviv. I mean, that's a wonderful thing, but that's not what going to Israel means. You can do that in Italy, not during Corona. You can do that in Greece, right? So Israel is, spiritually speaking, Israel is, could you make Israel a holy land? Could you sanctify the physical elements of your life? But the message is clear. The message is when God speaks to you, a moment of inspiration, of national effect, but even personal effect. When something happens to me and I'm inspired, a miracle happens, something the unexpected, I feel that God is reaching out to me, that feeling is not going to last forever. That's the message. You have to seize it and make that change in your life and implement that in your life, because later, by the time you're ready to open the door, he may or may not be here.
And so the thought is, because this is through Shlomo, that he's the one, he was prophesizing then. So he built the temple, and then
there's a beautiful interpretation from the Kli Yakar, so you probably heard it from me, but I never understood that. I forgot who, but one of the commentaries say it about Shir HaShirim. We know that Jewish history from Abraham to the destruction of the first temple was 30 generations. And the Zohar makes the point that the Medrash says the Jewish people are likened to the moon. You remember this when I speaking about this. The Jewish people are likened to the moon. And the moon waxes and wanes, and it starts out day 1, there's very little of the moon visible. Day 15, the moon is full, and then it starts waning until it disappears from the night. So the Medrash says, and the Zohar says, that Solomon is the 15th generation from Abraham. The moon is full. What does it mean? The relationship between the sun and the moon, the relationship between God and the Jewish people has climaxed. It's reached its max, and we reached its height. And that is the building of the temple. But just like we knew this, Solomon knows this. And Solomon knows that this honeymoon is not going to last forever. To the contrary, if we're like the moon, then we're also going to wane, and then there'll be rebirth. But we're also going to wane. It's not always going to stay. To think that the person is going to stay in the state of their honeymoon forever is foolishness. Even though a lot of people think that. And that's why Solomon writes the book, says, look, there's going to be a time when it's not going to be so simple. Even after the wedding, the husband's going to be knocking on the door and the woman is not interested in opening. And you can have all this history playing out. So either he had prophecy or he had common sense or he had both. But again, we believe it was prophecy. And that's why, like we said in the lesson 1, that Rabbi Akiva says, Shir HaShirim is holy. This is not a love story between a man and a woman. This is a prophecy about all of Jewish history. But it's not just prophecy. Remember, the underlying story is that God's love is present even when he's not, even when he runs away, right? The underlying part of the story is throughout the ups and downs, like Jill says, God doesn't have mood swings. But the underlying story is throughout all of this, God's love is God is still in love with the Jewish people. We may or may not see it, but that's part of the drama of the story. If we always saw it, we can't sell tickets. There's no drama. Okay, this has been enjoyable for me. Thank you for joining me in this journey through the Song of Songs. We have an extra scene, scene 4, plus the conclusion, plus we can talk from the Hasidic perspective. We can start the book again from the Hasidic perspective. We'll see how long we go with the Song of Songs. The main thing is it should be in good health, and the main thing is that when God's knocking, we should open the door. Simple as that.
Open the door quickly.
Open the door quickly. Yeah, don't worry about getting your feet dirty. That's the